Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Individualize Your Training with WKO5 Part 2, which is part of the Mastering WKO5 series. Don't forget, next week, I'm going to be doing the more advanced series, starting with Mastering the Art and Science of Coaching with Data. I'm really excited about these next couple of steps because I'm going to go to a much higher level and really talk about the utilization of data, how we kind of master things, and maybe more of an overarching philosophy of all these analytics and metrics and how to better blend them into your coaching. Today's part 2, like part 1, is focused a little bit more on the basics. Okay. Today we're focused, last week we focused on defining individualization, key metrics and their roles, key applications and output. Today, we're going to talk a little more about using the power duration curve, some of the training applications of what we can do with it, and I'm going to give you some general case studies and examples. As I said earlier, maybe I didn't, my name is Tim Cusick. I'm the Training Peaks WKO product leader. I'm also the head coach at joinbasecamp.com and velociouscyclingadventures.com. Getting back finally to some outdoor adventures, so that's great. As we go through tonight, please remember that everything we go through is generally my opinion. I mean, there's some things that are black and white, but it is my opinion. I do these webinars really in the hope that people can learn some about analytics, some about data, some about coaching and training. But what I really want is for you to go out and form your opinions, your coaching philosophies, your training metrics and measurements, your process. So I'm just showing you mine. I'm sharing it with general openness. I know I'm going to cover up a couple of things in tonight's piece, but generally I'm pretty open and I try to share mine, but I want you to go out and form yours. Please feel free to ask questions as we go. You can, go ahead and select the Q&A button and type in your question. Ask them as we go. I always say this, it's so much easier. I'm watching, sometimes you'll see me look over here. I have the questions on a second screen as they come up. I'll answer them as I go. This means we don't have to come back like a half an hour later and be like, oh, what was that question you had way back when? Okay. If you remember where we left off, part 1 of the series really talked about individualization. I'm going to have a hard time with that tonight. I gave some background on the power duration curve, how we developed it and what it does. We talked about the idea of having physiological metrics driven by a power duration model as part of our coaching process. I gave some demo of when, to use individualization, at what stages in kind of your coaching or your annual planning and it's important. And then I also went through the definition of all these different metrics. I then talked about kind of 4 elements of individualization. I talked about those new physiological metrics and how to use them, which of course were these. So let's pick up tonight talking about iLevels. And I see some familiar names in the list. I need to drink water. I'm having a hard time talking tonight. So some of this might be, something you've seen, but hopefully for a lot of you, it's new or at least a new explanation. So what are iLevels, individualized training levels? Let's go back to the fact that historically, really up to about the last 5 or 6 years, most training systems, programs, analytics, things like that, were based on a general set of rules. These rules were created by looking at a database, like a huge lump of performing data, power data, particularly in this situation, and heart rate data and stuff like that for some of the other things that were done. But here we're talking about power data. And in these, we kind of understood that about half the population pretty much performed in a very similar pattern. As human beings, we are unique. We are and need and utilize individualization in our training. But the reality is, if you think about us genetically, we are 99.9% the same. It's just that last little 0.1, which is dramatically different, right? And if we look at how humans perform, about 50% of us, I don't know, it could be 45, could be 60, but let's just say perform within the same normal range. This led to the early development of really the first power-driven training intensity targeting system. Dr. Andy Coggan came up with this idea of training levels, which have since become zones. That'll be part of the story we're going to get into here in a little bit. And he came up with 7 training levels. And these training levels were basically indicative of different physiological systems being stressed. Simple answer. And he came up with generalized targets, which were simply a percentage of FTP. But the reality is these percentages were based on looking at the bell curve of data. It wasn't meant to encapsulate everybody. It was meant as a best average, a best case scenario, the highest odds of you fitting within there, right? And it was created in a way that all that data was reviewed and said, well, most people are 106 to 120% of FTP when they're straining their VO2 max, when they're near or at VO2 max, right? And that's how the level was created. It was kind of like some development and some observation and some science all cooked together to make these generalized rules. And they work great. And they were actually a pretty amazing accomplishment if you think about it at the time. Power was new. We were just figuring out what to do with power meters. This was, I don't know, 22 years ago, 21 years ago. But the reality is, as we've now had more time to study a lot of power data and really dig into power data, we realize that a large variation occurs, particularly at shorter intervals. So each one of these lines represent a single athlete, and the percentage relationship of power as a percentage of FTP, I'm sorry, not a relationship, but power as a percentage of their FTP. And what you see out here in longer durations, we're all pretty similar. So when we're not going that hard, when we're in zone 2, right? In zone 3, we're pretty similar. We don't have such as a human beings, we don't have such a broad range of variation. As we get into shorter, let's call this 10 minutes and below, but really starts emerging probably at 5 and below, you see massive variations between us, and the way we perform. And the reality is the original classic levels, this idea of having a specific target intensity based off a bell curve, did not pick this up. It really was focused on kind of one curve running down the middle and being the average. So here the average doesn't look too bad, but here you can visually see the problem, right? That average has a lot more extreme to it, a lot more variation. Well, if you took 2 athletes and you put them side by side and said, wow, I'm going to compare these 2 athletes. I'm going to take Jane Ryder and I'm going to take Joe Ryder and I'm going to compare them. So I'll give you a little background on Jane and Joe here. They both have very similar FTPs, 275 versus 270, 5 watts, right? No big deal, pretty similar. Therefore, when we look at their classic training zones, their classic training zones look pretty familiar. Let's look at, pick something, VO2 max, 292 watts to 333 watts. VO2 max for Joe is 286 watts to 327 watts. So there's a 5-watt difference. No surprise, right? You probably guessed that. In their zone, they really are basically, when they go out and do VO2 max intervals, they're training at the same intensity. And probably the same time, right? You prescribe 4-minute intervals or 3-minute intervals, whatever your 5-minute interval, whatever your prescription in that VO2 max classic range is, they're basically doing the same time and intensity. Why? Well, they have the same threshold, right? So no real difference between them. Well, let's take a look at Jane and Joe on a power duration curve. Excuse me. Here we have Jane and Joe. The yellow represents their actual mean maximal power, and the red is their power duration, their modeled power duration curve. You look at these two quickly, again, pretty similar, right? Same threshold, same kind of number. But one thing you notice, and this is something that's always so hard to get this right in charts. I can tell you one of the things when I first started building WKO and we were working in this idea of charts, scaling is such a trick. Getting scale to really show everything you want is very difficult. And you might notice now that I put an arrow that these two have different scales. So pretty much all charts, you have to have them auto scale to what the data is, right? So what would happen in these charts if we removed the auto scale? And well, the reality is Jane goes off the chart. It's supposed to say 600 up here. I always know that's a mistake. This is Joe on the auto scale, and here's what happens to Jane. Suddenly, when we try on a fixed scale, when we try to put them on a fixed scale, they look dramatically different, don't they? You begin to see that even though they're similar FTPs, there's really something different about Joe and Jane. So the reality is when we look at these training levels or zones, and we see this idea that their VO2 max workouts are so similar, and as we discussed, the reality, because of this is the classic training zones, and there's times over here, right? There's kind of always been this general guideline of time ranges to do those efforts in. They're basically training the same intensity, same training target, time and intensity. But the reality is something really different between those two. Okay, well, what happens if we were to take these two and instead of just using this idea of FTP being a single anchor point for all training, we use the entire power duration curve, all, the data, to better individualize their training intensity targets and maybe even their training time targets. Well, that's what iLevels does. And I see this even, we've had iLevels out there for 5 or 6 years now, and I still see this confusion. iLevels use each athlete's entire curve. It's not just picking an FTP point and saying, here's a percentage, even though it does do that at aerobic and below. I'll explain that in a moment. But it's using the entire power duration curve so we can specifically target intensities. So let's take a look at what that actually means here. So here we see Jane and Joe, same two riders, same two thresholds, using individualized or iLevels. And let's just look at all the different training zones or levels above FTP. And we begin to see some dramatic differences than what we were seeing in the classic training level process. Pick FRC, right? Just picking a number, anaerobic capacity, FRC, 419 to 574 versus 390 to 465. So now we're seeing 100 watts plus difference. Same athlete, same FTP, same data set, right? Now you're seeing, though, to produce the appropriate amount of stress, external stress, right, to create the appropriate strain, internal, to get adaptation. Now, when we individualize these athletes, we see up to 100 watts in the prescription difference. So that's pretty dramatic, right? You could see the same at FRC, FTP, and look like PMAX, FRC, you're seeing 100 and, oh boy, I got to do math quick, 150 watts difference. So reality is it's a pretty big difference. Then we also, by individualizing, understanding the slope that is their curve, we can set time ranges. So go back to that FRC here. Jane is 39 seconds to 143 to have maximal impact, maximal stress and strain on that system. And Joe has 390 to 460, but he's 26 seconds to 1 minute and 1 second. So here you can see up to a, too much math tonight, 42-second difference, right? So when you begin to think about that, we have dramatic variations once we individualize our athlete, or athlete training intensity or athlete training targets, dramatic differences in that target. Now, one thing to note, when you look at kind of zone 2 and 3, the old classic below threshold zones, we still use percentages there. We never bothered to individualize it because every time we do, we come up with the same number. Remember that variation chart? I should have put that in here, We didn't see much variation at all in these, in the athletes. I got to go all the way back, but it's probably worth it. We don't see much variation here, so it wasn't worth it. We did individualize it, and the numbers were basically always the same. So it was easier to keep numbers below threshold the same. It's where we see all this variation above threshold that drives the individualization. And that's why you see in the iLevels, this is using kind of the classic percentages, where everything above is using the individualized mechanisms. Now, in reality, it probably makes sense to everybody. And here's a funny question. I was just having this discussion about 2 weeks ago with somebody. It's very obvious that these iLevels are important. And it, like, you listen to what I just said, and half you guys are probably like, but no, duh, right? There is some, but we've never had a targeting system up to iLevels came out that was targeted based on the users, the athlete, the trainer, the trainee, the coach prescriber. We never had an individualized system that did it for us, that helped us target it. iLevels really was the first that has brought this, and it really is still a great tool. It doesn't change, right? Because you don't change. We're still individualized. We still have the same power duration curve. We're still creating the same number. Well, our numbers variance, but the same model and output. What's really interesting to me in the sense of iLevels, and I did this in part one, is when is it important? And the answer kind of is in what I explained. I remember in the first webinar, hopefully you're able to see it, I talked about how individualization is really important in the planning phase. But in your early base training, it's not that important, right? You generally do pretty well on you could use the classic levels and do just fine with occasional smattering of some iLevel work. Why? Well, think about the nature of the work, or most of the work most of us are doing in that stage. If you're following a general periodized plan, you're doing a lot of work down here. So there isn't much variation between the classic and the iLevels. As you progress through the season and things become more specific, you introduce more specificity, which tends to mean you're introducing more intensity. iLevels become more and more important as your utilization tool. Understanding how to use these two tools, because the reality is they are general variations of themselves. If you look at the classic levels and kind of what we're working on, these iLevels have a relationship. They're just individualized to you. And there's a couple more, right? A little more specificity, but they're individualized to you. These are based off a percentage, based off a single anchor point, FTP. These are based generally on your entire power duration curve, therefore are more reflective of the performing individual. And remember the goal of WKO5 and this individualization of training. We wanted to better understand the performing athlete's unique physiology, and then be better able to use that unique physiology to produce better results in training. That's really what the whole goal is. And you see this more specific, more individualized intensity and duration targeting system doing just that. Cool. iLevels. The problem with iLevels, actually, this is a good way to sit back. And I've had this discussion probably 100+ times with Andy. And usually in a very positive and constructive way, but it took us a while to see eye to eye on this, because he's so smart. He's so good at what he does. When he created classic levels, and he said this, and if you follow back in the day when he was more on the internet, the training levels were descriptive. They were descriptive, meaning he would expect you to go out and do a hard 4-minute effort or a hard 30-minute effort or a hard something. And then when you analyze that power data, you would say, oh, they spent that time in tempo. That was tempo stress. And oh, they spent that time at VO2 max. That was VO2 max. He wanted the coach to use a different mechanism of prescription, RPE, a specific climb, a hard effort on a trainer. He wanted the coach to prescribe it in a way, but then give an analytical tool that was descriptive. And this is important because way back in the day when people would say, well, why wouldn't you want it to be prescriptive? He would tell you they weren't precise enough, that you really wanted the athlete to feel that effort and produce that effort, and then just analyze it and sort of make sure, did they do the right thing? And then give them advice like, oh, next time you need to go a little harder. The reality is when coaches first got iLevels, like we had with heart rate kind of targeting, we're like, wow, these make great prescriptions, right? And as a coaching group, we started prescribing them. And they still weren't precise enough. Then we went and introduced iLevels. And like I said, Andy and I discussed this 100 times. I'm like, dude, we need iLevels. We got to have this very specific. And we really wanted this more individualized approach. And we said, okay, here's what he's going to do. So we worked it out. Him and I spent a fair amount of time. I spent a lot of time riding a bike as hard as I could till I threw up to prove iLevels and models and stuff like that. And then when he wrote it and it was like, ta-da, here it is. And I'm like, man, these are great. And he's like, but they're still descriptive. They're still descriptive. To him, they were not precise enough. We have a tighter, more individualized tool with more zones and more specificity, but they weren't prescriptive enough. So that led us to the discussion like, okay, I need prescription. And that is how we ended up coming up with optimized intervals. What we looked at in the power duration curve, and now that we had the data, we had the ability, this very robust model of the human that was also smooth enough, it was accurate enough to build information on, we realized that we had specific adaptations, specific points in this curve where the performing human was going under some unique or maximal strain at the point where the intersection of intensity, how hard they were going, and duration, how long they were doing for, put real strain on that system. We were able to tease that out of the model. And that's a great question, John. I'm going to answer that in about 2 minutes, about 5 minutes. So once we saw that we could do that, we went back to this idea that in the end, we all make energy in 2 ways, really 3, but I'm sorry, 3 ways, really 2. You could just lump them into anaerobic and aerobic. And the reality is we have ATP, we have anaerobic glycolysis and oxidative system, right? So ATP, fight or flight, that's really fast. Bear jumps out of the woods, you're riding along on your mountain bike, you take off, that's ATP, fight or flight energy, readily available. It only lasts for a very short a time before it begins to decline. You have a crossover point, your anaerobic system, your anaerobic energy system takes over. That lasts longer, but not all that much longer, 45, 60 seconds kind of range. Then that begins to fade. And the reality is your big engine, right, is your aerobic engine, but it's not so fast in responding. So it takes a little longer to get up and rolling. We have some point of crossover, and then you press on. Well, what we realized we can tease out of the model is those intersection points, right? Because there's an intensity and a time element here. And we realized we could tease those points out of the model and give you a specific prescription. So we did a bunch of testing. Again, I was guinea pig for like a month. I spent a lot of time laying on the side of the road. No worries, guys, I'm okay. Pick one for the team. And we came up with the idea of optimized levels by being able to tease these specific points out. Optimized levels look like this. These are all in your cycling or whatever effort you're doing. They're most accurate for cycling training zones because they were designed around the efficiency of cycling, but it still does work for running. See people trying to look at it for rowing and other stuff. Maybe, maybe not. We haven't done the testing to say how well it would work, but excellent for cycling, solid for running. We'll work on rowing and some of those others as we get there. Okay, what iLevels are doing is these are the energy systems they're targeting. And this jives and aligns. I hate having to jump back and forth. But what you're seeing here in the middle, the real strain, what we're targeting in whether using classic or iLevels. So optimized intervals are the prescription, the key point of stress strain, or actually here particularly strain, what's going on internally for those. So if you wanted to go out and build a max aerobic, which people can often call a VO2 max or a max aerobic power interval, they're generally the same idea. Joe Ryder here, his perfect interval lasts for 2 minutes and 44 seconds and is 320 to 300 watts. You probably reverse that, right? Say 300, 320. So you have a pretty tight range, 20 watts as the target, but you have a precise time, 2 minutes and 44 seconds, which is actually a little shorter than what you typically see in the classic chart. And the reality is that is the key strain point for this athlete. and what they should be targeting. Now, would I prescribe a 2-minute and 44-second interval? No, I would say 2:45. Sure, right? You can round a little, smooth it out. Don't be so like you have your athlete doing, 2 minutes and 44 seconds might just sound a little odd, but it gives you excellent target insight. And I might tell, the range is 300 to 320. And you might prescribe, start at the bottom and then work however you do it. But that's a very clear intersection of that point. Now, imagine there's a line. I normally have this on the chart. Somehow I must have deleted it. There's a red line. Just imagine there's a red line here. These ones, I was working with Dean Golich. Dean and myself really wrote these general guidelines. And these are guidelines. This isn't science because we don't have really great ability to manage repeatability yet. We don't have enough variables, enough data to do that. So here's what we're recommending as number of reps when we're doing this kind of work. Total time in zone. So what it means by TIZ is time in zone estimate, and it's progressive. Whenever you see the word progressive, that means your first workout might be closer to, let's say you do the first workout, you do 5 times, or I'm not going to be able to do the math. 5 times 2:45 is what? 12 minutes. Pretend like it's right. It's not that far off, is it? Yeah, say it's 13 minutes. So the first set is 13 minutes. But then when I do that workout again, I want to get a total time in zone of 14 or 15 minutes. And then when I do that workout again, I want to get a total time in zone in 14 to 16 minutes. That's what it means, be progressive, meaning the zone isn't always fixed. You want to progress that total time in zone of those intervals because you always need to be adding new stimuli if you want the athlete to continue to adapt. I'll give you a little tip here about interval prescription, which could be dangerous standalone, but I do an interval webinar, look it up. Most people don't progress their interval work fast enough, that they're kind of doing, I'm going to do 6 times 3 minutes or 5 times 3 minutes or 7 times 3 minutes. I'm going to do that for 3 weeks in a row or 2 weeks in a row. Try to progress almost every time you do the same type of intervals. So every time I'm doing a max aerobic power or a VO2 max intervals, I'm trying to add a little more every time we do that workout. Now, be cognitive of your athlete's fatigue, don't push too hard, but the reality is you should be able to push that progression pretty quickly. Now, if we look at the prescription, and then I'm going to answer, I've got some good questions built up. If we look at the prescription of optimized intervals in these ranges between Jane and Joe, same person, I've been bringing the same, remember, they started out training exactly the same, right? And you can see them individualized in levels. And now, wow, what happens when we go to optimize? If we wanted to build their max aerobic, let's just pick that, right? So Jane needs 5 minutes between 316 and 296. Joe needs 2 minutes and 44 seconds between 320 and 300. I know those are backwards. So we see now a significant difference in the targeting of what it would take to improve their power at VO2 max or their VO2 max, right? If you aren't using individualized levels and using optimized intervals as target individual, so you have the target is the optimized interval, and then the iLevels give you excellent tracking. So you finally have the prescription. Optimized intervals are giving you the prescription. Then when you look at it against the backdrop of iLevels, time in zone, things like that. Now you have the description. That is so simple and so powerful because when you start delivering them together, you are doing what I said earlier about the goal of individualization. You're using the athlete's unique physiology, right? And you're using their data to understand that unique physiology. Then you're using that unique physiology to train them better. And it really is one of the simple elements that are here, but yet doesn't get utilized enough. We tend to just, once we get into that specialization phase and we're starting to push towards peak, we don't use optimized and individualized. We override with mental bias. No, I like a 4-minute interval better for Joe. Think twice about that. The model might be smarter than you think. So I'm going to stop actually here because there's one or two questions I want to tackle. The first question is from John. If we're using a training program that incorporates iLevels, do individual specifics adjust according to the athlete's process? Yes, right? They absolutely do. And in reality, I'm going to show you some case studies and I'll talk about this. And I should have I had this slide in there, but I'm trying to make the webinars a little shorter, but this is why I hate making them shorter, to be honest with you. The beauty of iLevels, John, and you're thinking about it correctly, and everybody listening, as long as you're maintaining your model, which can be unstructured testing, you don't even need formal testing. You can even test every 6 to 8 weeks to maintain your model, even though depending on the time of year, you should be doing it a little more frequently. The model changes, the iLevels change, the optimized interval changes with the progression or regression of your athlete fitness. And that's so important because the other problem with classic training levels, they assume that FTP isn't moving until you have some big grandiose test. If you're doing unstructured testing like I've taught in the power duration model, and some simply just putting in some max, if you're racing, heck, you would see it. Your iLevels, your optimized intervals and your iLevels are evolving with you or with your athlete. And they're picking up micro changes in fitness and changing. It is technically feasible that your iLevels can change 1 or 2 times a week and keep your training prescription more accurate and more specific. Because when we talk about the need for individuality, I said this in the first session. Here's another really great tip. It's not just about the athlete's unique physiology. It's about the point on the continuum of training they're in. Because that is part of individuality. What's their adaptation rate? How much are they currently adapting? How well do they deal with acute and chronic fatigue? All that's happening in that mechanism. You want a system that's capturing that and evolving your targeting with you. A really good checkpoint is to compare it to history. Meaning go back and look at when you've done, a couple of weeks of VO2 max intervals or maximal aerobic power intervals, and how did they, what kind of numbers were they hitting on the first ones versus the second ones versus the third? And I bet you'll see change, but that wasn't necessarily reflected in your targeting or your classic training levels, right? Only the iLevels would pick that up. So hopefully that's a good answer, John. John goes on to ask, and I'm going to tackle this one too. Does Training Peaks makes the adjustment automatically? No, Training Peaks has not put the power duration curve online. It's only available in the WKO. Now, obviously, we all know we work together and they're all synced and things you need to do. But that does mean for you as the coach or a self-coach athlete, you have to edit your intervals every time there's a change. There's some shortcuts. You can set up your iLevels zones. If you look in Training Peaks, there's zones and you can use other zones now. Set up other zones with the iLevels. And that takes a little more manual work, but it works great for structured workouts, targeting, things like that. And automation of that has been on the table for a bit. And to be honest with you, I only work WKO. I don't know what their development schedule is. Mike, I get this question a lot. I'll tackle this last one before I go on to a couple of case studies. When you're testing for the above threshold power, 4 to 5, 1 minute, 15, 20 seconds, are you asking the athletes to stay seated? Mike, I want max power. If they can stand, make max power, seat, make max, if they could pedal with their hands and get 5 more watts, whatever, I want the max power. The thing is, right, with really good modeling, and whether you're calling an FTP test, like a classic FTP test or whatever, you have to drive max data. One of the things I don't like about the 20-minute test, the 20-minute test often overdoes power. It comes out a little high. But the prescription, if you truly read the prescription, is you should do a 5-minute hard effort and then the 20-minute effort, and that'll buff it down a little bit. But yet in the same point, it makes that 20-minute test too tired. You're too tired when you go into it. So you're really not max. In the power duration system, max is max, baby. Just go out there, crush it, everything you got, however you've got it, and it will make a very nice, clean model, and it will represent you better. Important that you do max. There's a whole webinar on that. I always want to go deeper on that question, but good question. All right. With those two in mind, right, I just want to give some general case study with, not with those two, with these three. So in case studies, I'm not going to do these case studies like, wow, we're going to get into this. Here was Joe athlete, and this was their problem, and we're doing this and we're doing that, and blah blah blah. Because I will in my future webinars. This really is just set the foundation. This is the basic and beginning. Come along on the journey with me this winter. The next one I'm going to do is mastering the art of coaching with data. That one is a little more about big picture data, but then I'm going to do annual planning, base training design, building better intervals. So we're going to get very into the application of it, but I want to make sure everybody has the basic starting point, the overview of coaching with data, then we're going to get into the functions of coaching. So just know I'll go a little deeper as we go forward. Simple case studies, looking at the power duration curve, metrics as a tracking. Now, one of the important things I said last week too was you should only measure the metrics and utilize the kind of metric approach every like couple of months. Like it depends on your training. Like if you're going to do 3 or 4 months of base training, right? You might want to do it. You always should do it at the beginning, get your baseline, know your metrics, understand the physiology, use that to individualize your training strategy. As you go through base training, I don't overly look at the metrics. I'm looking at power. I want to know, is the power getting better? Is power relationships getting better? Something I'm going to give you a sneak preview in a couple of slides of. I want to know if their power to heart rate is getting better. I still use heart rate. Heart rate has too much variability to coach by, but gives us excellent insight in relationship to effort, and should be utilized in ways to gauge fitness, which I'll teach in future webinars. But I don't want to get overly lost in the I'm just looking at power. Is power going up? Is power to heart rate improving? Is efficiency improving? I'm looking at things like that. But every other cycle or so, I am then going back into the metrics and looking for physiological shift. Here's why, right? One of the elements of great coaching always comes down to cost benefit. I know I'm applying a strategy. I've looked at my athlete, I've individualized, I understand, the needs of my athlete and the demands of the event, and I set out and I've applied a training strategy, and that training strategy might be working. But the place all these individualized metrics help you understand is, what is the cost benefit analysis of that improvement? Is the result I'm getting worth the cost? Because the reality is, when you set out with any type of specificity, you're focused on one area of that power duration curve, the other areas get worse. Meaning just that. Specificity has a price. You spend 2 months working on your sprint, your FTP will go down. End of story. There's always a cost. But by being able to use the model, which evolves with the athlete, right, gives you real-time individualized information, using those metrics at key points can help. So here's an example, little mountain bike training. Mountain start out, we're before Pmax of about 1,375 watts, pretty solid sprint, solid FRC, good VO2 max at about 65.1, threshold of about 255, a longer time to exhaustion. They set out and they do a lot of training, and look, things move, right? I need to put that to music. Dun, 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 dun. Things move. And this, by looking at this, again, not every day, use power heart rate, other things every day, but every 8 weeks, right? Now I begin to understand, well, wow, this athlete needed more threshold. Man, I had to improve their threshold so they compete. They needed to stay up with the leaders. They needed to be able to sustain power. So we set out on a strategy to build threshold. Well, the reality is we built a little VO2 max, we built a little threshold, but we did end up increasing FRC, and Pmax basically stayed the same. So it gives us insight, and TTE went down. So it gives us insight, like you set out to do one thing and something else happened. Now I know, wow, wasn't quite expecting that, right? You got to go back, look through your workouts, do deeper analytics, and try to figure out what was different. Because now that I can quantify it, now that I can measure that change, it gives me insight to look backwards. Now, a question I've been getting a lot, and I'm going to answer it here with a visual, is people are tracking metrics every day. And there are how these metrics interact. There's more metrics that we have, like VLA max. I get a lot of questions. I used to get a lot of questions. It's kind of died down recently about VLA max. And like, wow, well, a lot of the discussion, like VLA max, could be too high, and the person couldn't win because their threshold power would then be too low. So they needed to work to reduce VO2 max and increase threshold power. And then they were trying to get into this balanced range, or vice versa. Their VLA max was too low, so they didn't have the punch when they needed. So they needed to work on that. We've always known that, you guys. It's easy enough. And we'll go way back into just simply power profiling athletes. We knew punchy sprinters and pursuiters versus time trialists, right? We've always had a way. So people ask me all the time, what do you measure? Do you use? And I've been answering more and more. I don't use VLA max, and I actually don't use these metrics except for about once every 8 weeks when I'm trying to measure change and do a cost benefit analysis. What I use is this, and this is a secret to all 100 of you. Don't share this on the internet till I share it in about an hour. But this is something we're working on for a fall release. I'm going to not answer all your questions on it yet till it comes out. But the reality is, what you're always measuring when we're thinking about the relationship of these metrics, Pmax to threshold and FRC to threshold and power at VO2 max, or at threshold, you're measuring this idea of balance, right? So every athlete needs a certain amount of power balance. I don't like using that term because Garmin uses it for left-right pedaling, but it really applies here, because by power balance, I'm referencing how their anaerobic system and their aerobic system, right, produce power working together. So if you train an athlete, right, and say you're doing a 12-minute test, 12 minutes, maximum effort test, and you do it 1 week and they do 300 watts. Then you train them for 8 weeks and you do that 12-minute test again and they do 340 watts. You're like, wow, that's more than a 10% improvement. We totally rocked, right? And you're true, the power gets higher. But if you want to understand how they can then better apply that in racing or make it work for them in an event, you need to understand what made that power. Was it the fact that you did some work and they're getting greater anaerobic contribution to the longer effort, burning more carbs, but yet getting a higher power for that carb output? Was it the fact that you improved their fatty acid oxidation? They're burning more fats as fuel. So therefore that utilization, that efficiency is better, right? And is that effort coming from fats as fuel? And then if they were to take this, effort, this metric, this whatever, and have to go race, are they well balanced? Do they have enough punch to go with the moves they need to? And do they have carb burning anaerobic? And do they have enough long-term threshold fatty, threshold and below fatty acid oxidation, fat utilization, oxygen-based energy? Anaerobic is in the absence of oxygen, right? So by being able to determine a balance between those two, we understand the athlete's power balance between anaerobic and aerobic power. I've been tracking that for years with my athletes. I look at it all the time. I don't use the metrics, so to speak, even though they always align with the metric change. And why do I look at the power every day? Because power is what we want. In the end of the day, I look at the metrics every 8 weeks and it gives me excellent understanding of how their what's driving the reality. And I can understand cost benefit kind of well enough there. But what I really want out of my athlete is power. I want to know, are they more powerful? And if so, I want to know what's driving it. So as a coach, I can help them apply it in training. So one of the athletes I train is a world-class time trialist. So I have to be careful here because she's actually on this webinar. I'm going to out her. And I get this question all the time, right? She's a time trialist. What's her threshold, man? I mean, she's crushing it. What's her threshold? Elite time trialists do not time trial at threshold. They time trial above threshold, supra threshold, right? So when you're training somebody at that level, you're working on supra threshold. Supra threshold means that they have, yes, of course, they have a really big fat burning engine. To be a great time trialist, you need to be able to make amazing aerobic energy. But they're also, for X amount of time, out to about, for a female, out to about 40 to 45 minutes, can maintain supra threshold. Like literally they're above threshold, they're tolerating a higher level of lactate than they can, or they should be able to, because they're burning more carbs. That's the byproduct, right, of what's occurring. Way oversimplification, by the way, folks. And they're just tolerating it. They've trained their bodies to do that. So things like balance to them is really important. I might look for that athlete to have, you would think, oh, well, they're just they're a time trialist. They should have a very low anaerobic contribution. But by understanding how she's making power and knowing that right mix, I have the targets up here. We need some, and that's why we're going to roll this out. You're probably going to see this in the fall with some guidelines and guidance. But I also, just knowing that this athlete over the training is now making 10 more watts than she was, 12 weeks ago, what's driving it gives me excellent insight into how she's going to time trial. Because I know she needs to time trial above threshold, and she needs a certain amount of that anaerobic contribution driving that power, because it's supra threshold. It's an example where that athlete's balance might not be the same as me in a race. I'm a sprinter. I'm definitely more of that punchy person. I need that anaerobic to be able to finish, but man, I spend more time building threshold just so I could stay in. That balance is a little different for all of us, but understand what I'm saying. By unlocking it, you understand how improvement in power, the changes in the underlying physiological engine, can get applied to racing. So when people ask me about, well, VLA max, when are we going to have it? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? I use the actual power number. I don't want to use a number that builds a model that creates a metric, and then I use the metric. Use the number. It's a shorter path, and it will give you clearer data. And what power balance is doing is taking, like, I use two trackers, power at FRC, or anaerobic capacity, right? And then threshold power, and what's that percentage? AC, anaerobic capacity, to AP, and aerobic power, anaerobic capacity to aerobic power. What's that balance? I do the same for power at VO2 max, or maximal aerobic power, to threshold power, and then a MAP, or maximal aerobic power, to aerobic power balance. There is tremendous power in understanding and looking at these numbers over time and as you apply training. Find your ways, build your opinion. That's mine. I'm going to share that in the fall. We'll talk about this idea of power balance. We need a better name, right? Because Garmin stole that one. But we have some things coming down that'll show you. These are model related, but power-based metrics. So a little hindsight for there. Where they really can get powerful is when you use the compare mode of WKO, and you're comparing these over time and looking at the changes in these percentages. And that's important when you particularly understand the performance of the athlete. When were they racing well? When were they racing poorly? When were they peaking? What were those peaks? Now we understand where their balance was during different time ranges. And you can do this in base and build and peak, or you can do that 2017 compared to 2022, right? It gives you a really powerful tool to understanding where the power is coming from and how the athlete can apply it in performance. All right, that's my teaser. I didn't tell you how I did it and come on those numbers, and I'm not sure how much we'll put out. I mean, when we do, I'll put out what it's measuring, but I'm not going to quite say how we created it. All right. I probably could have done this to the time trial. Here's a time trialist example, not the same time trialist. I took the same athlete numbers and just said, wow, what if we had a time trialist and we tried to, I know I got this example wrong. I said we did a lot of FTP work. I meant to say we needed to raise FRC. Here, like, wow, we have a time trialist who needs more threshold. We need to raise that threshold. Well, we do that, right? And we dramatically change. There's my music. Dun, 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 dun. There's the after. So the reality is, yes, we made really great gains in threshold, but man, we cost them some Pmax. We actually got a little FRC gain and a little VO2 max gain. When you make this kind of change, it's usually multifaceted. That's a pretty big increase. It usually will lift some other numbers. So you would look at this and say, wow, that's a great result. Yeah, I gave up a little TTE, my time to exhaustion. When I start falling off, this threshold number comes a little earlier, but man, that's still pretty good. And I gave up 200 watts sprint, but since I'm time trialing, that's okay. The cost benefit of this was okay. So now I'm going to show you another chart I use all the time, because this is also, since I'm now talking metric and power, right? We get absorbed in the tree or the trees. And we really want to break athletes down to this individual workout and what we're doing. Part of what I'm doing here by saying, look at the physiological metrics every 8 weeks, right, is you come up and you look at the forest. Looking at power every day, that's trees, and that's important too, but you got to be careful it doesn't take over your entire view. And sometimes when you look at the forest, the causality of something bad or something good is in that forest perception. It's not what you expect. So this is not the same athlete I'm going to show you, but it was an example I wanted to share, because this is a world tour woman athlete, not one that I coach. World tour woman athlete who asked me for some help, was able to see her data. We went through a little consult. And here's what I saw. She had her worst season ever this year, and her power's been declining all year. And this is where always come back, right? I'm talking metrics. Part of individualization, I'm going to go back to this point. It's not just your unique physiology. It's training progression, training. Where am I at in that training spectrum? I mean, put over here, totally untrained. Put over here, totally overtrained, right? Everything in between is your training spectrum. It's a journey that you go on in training, or you take your athlete on and your athlete goes on. That journey isn't just change. It isn't just metrics, right? It's load, it's other factors, it's stress life, it's recovery, it's all these other things you need to be thinking about. But sometimes the answer is kind of right in front of you. So you look at this athlete, this is a PMC. I designed this, I use it all the time. People are like, no, what do you really use? And I'm like, no, this is the PMC I use. And all this is showing, I don't need to explain to this group what CTL, ATL is, but this takes the TSB, and this rates it by colors, and it uses your historical training load to set targets. So it knows what you've done historically. And it's just knowing when you're doing a lot or the right or the rested. So you look at this athlete's ramp rate. The pink is actually the ramp rate. So you can see it. You just see it in this steepness here. Sort of no rest, no planned rest, no scheduled rest. Look how many weeks, days, extended period this athlete was in overload mode. So for me, here's a direct coaching tip. I always want 2 overloads, maybe just 1, 2 overloads, depends on the athlete maturity. And for about somewhere between 5 to 9 days, I want that into the red in an entire year, right? This is, I don't know, 60 days, 40, 50. It's hard to tell. I could separate it out and figure it out. But, we're looking at a pretty big time range here, an entire year, way too many days in overload. What this athlete's coach was doing that just crushed him was the uptake, the rate of increase in training load was simply too high. So the athlete was in overload mode so much they couldn't improve. The rate of uptake was so high, the overload mode. I'm sorry, I was reading that question. Sometimes the questions distract me, but that's a good one, Ken. I'll target it. I'll get it. That rate of overload was too high too frequently. Too often it was too high. Occasional bouts of it are good for you, right? We got to overreach and challenge, but always being in overload is, she was just too fatigued. By the time race season, it looks like she has peaks here because it's just peaks of the year. If you compared it to our historical data, she was down 10% all year and getting worse as this one, and she couldn't train anymore. You could see it. She simply was too tired to continue to train. So she just kept having to skim off training load, skim off training load. And she did not, and she had one of her race. She's a former dual national champion. And she just had and it was a shame what she went through. And there was no analysis by her coach. Her coach never came back and did this, never looked at it, never stopped, never changed the strategy. And she just broke down and couldn't train. The only reason this went down is she couldn't do it anymore. And you could see she had to take massive blocks of time off. So Ken asked the question, what is overload? Great question. And you guys, please feel free to go Q&A. Those are my simple case studies. Could have done these two a little smoother, but I wanted to show this thinking to just show you that individualization is not always physiological. So Ken asked, and would you define overload? So if you think about general adaptation syndrome, GAS, right? Whenever we talk about training and how we adapt to training, it's GAS. General adaptation syndrome. We introduce a new stimuli, your body goes through this alarm phase. During the alarm phase, that early introduction of new stimuli, you perform less, meaning your performance goes down. But then your body begins to adapt to that new stimuli and performance goes up. That's known as the stage of resistance. You're beginning to resist. I can do this, right? My body's resisting that new stimuli. Screw you, new stimuli, we can do it. And you start performing, right? And you can take load doing that. Your body will continue to go. But as you add more and more load, eventually you get to a plateau, which is known as exhaustion or the exhaustive stage, where the early part of that stage, my terminology, Ken, you begin to overreach, functionally overreach. And that's when you're doing enough training load that, man, I'm on that sort of ragged edge, but I'm still adapting to the training load. If you keep pushing that, then they go into non-functional overreaching, which is they can still sort of do the work, but they can't adapt to it. The body's too fatigued in between sessions and in that acute fatigue, so that there's just no energy left to adapt. In those two phases, that is overload as a whole, meaning you're going into that really deep overreach, that really deep push. So in reality, it's a load that is X% higher than you've done versus the previous load you did. Trying to think of a really good definition. And that means, you know how the old rule is you should add like 10% each week? That's really not a bad rule. It's a pretty good guideline. If you're adding 30% each week, you'd be in overload, right? You've stepped up each week too much. The way WKO is thinking about overload, it's looking at your historical ramp rate and just saying, what has this athlete done historically? And when that deviates a certain amount of standard deviations, that's more than the athlete's done. It's faster, it's overload. They might not be prepared for that. So it's a warning sign, which a little bit of red is good, right? Because you always need to be pushing. You need to overreach at times. And hopefully that overreach is a functional overreaching, or that overload is a functional overreaching. But too much of it, the body, it's too much. You just break down. They need to be short doses. Like even for, I'll use Amber as an example. Sorry, Amber, I named you. I know you're on that, called you out. So when Amber and I were preparing for the Olympics, we did a camp about 8 weeks out, a big overload camp, the big overload of the year. Really the only one we did, but it was massive. She was red 7 out of the 9 days we were in camp. It was more work than she's ever done, which was amazing for her as an athlete and her maturity. I think it was like 1,000 miles and a lot of climbing work and time trial style intervals and all this stuff in a 8-day period. And it was red, but that was the only red we saw like really in her year. So well-timed overload, very targeted for that. The overload meant that red meant it was more than she's been doing. It was a ramp rate, an increase of load at such a fast rate that that's overload. Ken, you stumped me on that. You know what? I've never had to do, I'm gonna have to write the definition of overload out and get better on that. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. It's that extra step up. If you've historically done 10, 10, 10, or adding, a CTL ramp rate of 3 to 5 is your ramp rate, and suddenly you jump to 10 ramp rate. It's that when you take that big step up, and I think the setting here is more than 2 standard deviations away from the norm to go red. Hopefully that answers your question. So, or I could really simplify all that. It's like, wow, you suddenly did a lot of training, a lot more than you're used to, a lot more than you might have been ready for. So you can put that in the annals of science, right? How did Tim define overload? He defined it by saying a lot. All right, let's go to open Q&A. I'm going to answer the 2 questions I have. You guys, thanks for coming today. You don't have to stay on for Q&A. If people have questions, I'll answer them deep. I will remind you, though, this was the basic get started, understand the basic fundamentals and facts of individualization. Next week, we're moving on to more advanced stuff. As a matter of fact, next week jumps into big picture mastering data. How should I use data? What role does it play? The difference between knowledge and mastery. I'm going to try to really give you the big picture, and then we're going to spend the rest of the winter digging in deep. All right, so Nestor picks up, interesting question. I've been looking how my parameters adjust automatically while I'm progressing. Instead, do the adjustments manually. Yeah, Nestor, I think you're referring back to how you can do it in Training Peaks. You can make the adjustments manually. You can watch your power duration curve and your iLevels change, and then just change your targeting for workouts or create other zone, a unique set of zones in Training Peaks and manage it that way. Greg asks, is this chart available in the library? Not yet, Greg. That's why I said it's kind of a teaser alert. It will be out soon. We're working on a new release. I think we'll see it in 2 to 3 weeks. Kevin Williams is now going to kill me because every time I put a date to something, I get in trouble. And it will come out in that. I'll probably beta test it a little bit in the power Facebook Power Group, WKO Power Group. But until we're running a lot of data analysis on it, we're trying to come up with a profile and give people some clear understanding of some guidelines of how to use it. But it's been it was a way I've done it for a while, and it's kind of cool when you then can take that. I have this luxury, right, which is an absolute luxury. Thank you, Training Peaks, is we can look at like a theory, like my theory, and then I can look at it against large data sets and very quickly and get a pretty good feel. So we're still working through that. You should see it in a couple of weeks. Awesome. Well, I either did such a good job or I bored everybody to sleep. That's tonight's webinar. Thank you everybody for coming. I am just going to post this live by tomorrow morning for people who want to see it. Make sure you sign up. I'll also post next week's webinar. It's somewhere in the Facebook group now. Next week webinar, we're getting into advanced coaching. So jump on in and join us then. Thanks, everybody. Good night.